Hi everyone. We will start in around 8 minutes, so thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to share the room. It will be a really interesting talk by the neurologist who is at the Veterans Hospital in Boston about his research on Alzheimer's, and so will be really interesting, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. And he should be here in like a few minutes, so thank you. Oh, I'm pinning the paper that we will mostly discuss today. On top of the room should be open access, so if you want to, in the meantime, start looking at it, feel free to do so. Thank you. Actually, I'll just change to his... he's here. Let me see, but he clicked on the wrong... There. Okay, our guest speaker is on Clubhouse right now. Just didn't find the right link. How are you? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm going to grab my headphones. I found the audio is slightly better when I wear my headphones.
Oh, yeah, sure. We still have like 4 minutes, so we're good. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, feel free to check out Andrew's website. There's like a summary of his research and so on, so it's really interesting. And I also shared the link into the chat, so later when I switch to the paper, you still have that.
So, Katerina, can you hear me
Yep.
well?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming here. It's so nice of you to make that time.
Happy to do it.
And in the meantime, I put a link to your Alzheimer's research profile, and then I'll switch to the paper once we start talking, basically.
Good, great.
And yeah, usually, so I'll start by introducing you, and then usually we ask like a few interview kind of warm up, get to know you as a scientist or researcher, and then we usually switch to discussing the topic and then Q&A if that's good with you.
Yes. Any way you want to do it is fine with me.
Okay, perfect. Happy Friday. I hope glad the storm won't be bad where we are.
Where
anymore.
are you in New York?
Yeah. Yeah, but it will be only rain and, some wind, but I don't think it will be bad. So,
Right. Is it raining yet?
yes, it started raining.
Yeah. So we're a couple hours behind you. It's supposed to start in about 2 hours.
Okay. It was actually nice weather this morning. It was quite warm and sunny, but now it's raining. Well, it could be worse. But the tropical storm in November is so weird.
Yes, this is true.
And they warned me that I'm traveling next week, that the flights might be affected, but I don't think it will on Sunday anymore. I'll leave on Sunday and then I'll be back next week.
So can I ask you what I believe you're a professor at NYU. Can I ask what you do there?
Yeah, I'm assistant professor, non-tenure track one.
Hmm.
And I mostly do, basically apply for grants with colleagues, and mostly I work for my own company now.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I did like a mental health early diagnosis tool, which is probably helpful for English speaking places, but it's probably my plan was to make it really into turn it into other languages too, where there's not good health, like mental health
Hmm.
infrastructure.
And diagnosis of what disorders?
So we started with depression because there was already published data around kind of um, there was a lot of raw data and data
Hmm.
there to kind of
Hmm.
replicate what people worked. They didn't really made a tool out of it, but the research was kind of there. And then we transitioned to PTSD actually, because kind of that was mostly the collaborations also we could have. And then we had then control groups of soldiers, police officers, and firefighters without and with PTSD. And then we transitioned to impulsivity, because it's more related to addictive state tendencies,
Hmm.
and then we then decided to try resilience. So and
Hmm.
then we improved it a lot, the resilience tool, and that is kind of the tool I decided to make only commercially available, because I didn't want people to get labeled bad when I use it to profit making, because I wanted to use the profits then to do actual research,
Hmm.
and and drug targets and things like that. So,
No, it sounds wonderful.
thank you so much. Okay, I think we can actually start. So, welcome everyone to Science Society, and of course, a special welcome to Andrew. And before we start, I'll give an introduction so you get to know him a little bit better. And yeah, as I said, feel free to share the room. I'll also do that in a minute. And yeah, so welcome, Andrew. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. We really appreciate it. And Dr. Andrew Budson, he is the chief of cognitive behavior neurology and associate chief of staff for education at the VA Boston healthcare system, and associate director and education core leader at Boston University and Alzheimer's Disease Center. And he's also the professor of neurology at Boston University School of Medicine and a lecturer in neurology at Harvard Medical School. And Dr. Andrew Budson received his bachelor in chemistry and philosophy from Haverford College, and his medical degree from Harvard Medical School. And then he did an internship in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And then he was a resident and a chief resident in neurology at the Harvard Longwood program. He was a clinical fellow in behavioral neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a research fellow in psychology at Harvard University. And his current research interest focuses mostly on understanding memory in patients with Alzheimer's disease and other brain disorders. And he works most recently a lot with patients that suffer under Alzheimer's disease, and he focuses on reducing false memories and using strategies to address that. So he also won a different award. So it's really a pleasure having you here. And when I read your paper and your work, I was really intrigued because it's a question I also always had in my mind about what consciousness is, what defines us. So it's such a wonderful work you did. Before we start, as I said, we have usually a few questions for our guest speakers, and the first one would be, how did you discover, or how did you choose the path of doing research, and also being interested in medical sciences? Like, was it something like a childhood dream? Was it something that you discovered later on to have a passion for it? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So I have been interested in the biological basis of thinking and memory really since I was in high school. And so when I went to college, I wanted to try to, get all the right sort of knowledge and skills and experience to sort of tackle problems like understanding how thinking and memory actually work in the brain. And so I double majored in chemistry and philosophy, as you mentioned, to try to get at sort of both ends of the problem. And I thought for a while about, maybe getting a PhD in neuroscience, but neuroscience at the time that I was in college was really something that was involved with single cells or animal models, and it really seemed very distant and far from actual thoughts and memories and consciousness and things like that. And so I thought actually becoming a medical doctor and actually working with patients would be the right way to go to try to get at these types of issues. And it also pulled another part of my personality, which is I have a strong drive to make the world a better place. And so I thought, being a doctor would be a good way to do that as well. And so when I entered medical school, I knew for sure that I was going to do either psychiatry, neurology, or neurosurgery. And I ended up choosing neurology because when I would sort of hang out with psychiatrists and neurologists and neurosurgeons, it seemed to be that the neurologists were the ones who were both interested in talking about things like consciousness and also were sort of approaching the issue with a certain amount of rigor that I really liked, and so that's how I knew I wanted to be a neurologist. And then throughout my training, I began to see patients with strokes and other diseases of their brain, and I began to sort of see how these different disease processes would alter language or perception or awareness of space or awareness of one's own body or ability to move one's body or ability to understand speech, all sorts of things like that. And it sort of continued to sort of trigger my interest in disorders like consciousness. And um, I ended up going to a conference in 1996 when I was, I think, in my last year of residency, called Toward a Science of Consciousness. And I was really excited. This was held in University of Arizona at Tucson. And my takeaway from the conference is that there was no science of consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't a lot of good scientists that were working hard on the problem, but it just, at least to me, it did not seem like it had congealed into sort of a real bona fide science, something that I could like do a postdoc in and set up a lab and start doing consciousness research. It just seemed to me that the field wasn't quite there. But when I was at the conference, I did meet actually a researcher from Harvard, Daniel Schachter. And I ended up doing my work with him in part because he actually wrote the section on consciousness in a famous textbook called The Cognitive Neurosciences, edited by Michael Gazzaniga. And Schachter did that section of the book because he was working on distinguishing uh, conscious memory or explicit memory from unconscious memory or implicit memory. And he was sort of an expert in the intersection. So it seemed to me that he was the right person to do my work with. And then I had wonderful training from him and his team on how to conduct experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience experiments, particularly related to memories. And we spent a lot of time on false memories, which are memories for things that didn't actually happen, which I thought was pretty cool. And basically, since that time, I've been sort of applying the tools and techniques of experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience to understand thinking, memory, sometimes consciousness in both healthy individuals and individuals with brain disorders. But this particular paper really came about through writing a book with a co-author, Elizabeth Kensinger, who's also a co-author of this paper that is titled, the book is titled, Why We Forget and How to Remember Better, the Science Behind Memory. And it was an opportunity for me to really dive into exactly how memory works in a very sort of deep and detailed um, um, way. And one of the books that Elizabeth mentioned was a book by William James, Principles of Psychology. And it's a classic book. It was written in 1890. And I had known about it for a lot of years. And Elizabeth was telling me how good this book was. And I'm like, yeah, I think I should go ahead and give this book a read. And this was in the middle of the pandemic. And, we all, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, we seemed to have a little bit of extra time because, we couldn't do at least some parts of our usual jobs. And so I started reading Principles of Psychology. And uh, what I didn't know until I started to read it is it really is a book that's an inquiry into consciousness. William James was very interested in consciousness, our ability to have conscious thoughts, to be aware of things, to use imagination, conscious perception, and um, and so this really sort of sparked my interest in consciousness again. And I started working on consciousness and the nature of consciousness directly at this time. And I called up a friend of mine, Ken Richmond, who was a philosophy major with me at Haverford College, and and so he and I would like meet every other week and talk about um, consciousness and what I was reading in the book, and we decided to read some other books and papers together on consciousness, and it was sort of the conjunction of talking with Ken and talking with Elizabeth and my own personal experience and research, and some of it my own life experience, that sort of led to coming up with this idea. So sorry that was a little long-winded, but that's sort of how my interests in general came about, and my interest specifically in this paper occurred.
Oh, that it's perfect. I didn't even have to answer any follow-up questions. You already answered all of them. And it's such a beautiful story of just following the path of curiosity, that I find really inspiring, and it led to, to this really interesting paper. So that's wonderful that you pursued this, and that we have the opportunity to pursue our curiosity. As I wish more people had the chance, but I kind of think we are very lucky in that way. And yeah, if you want to go ahead to talk about a little bit about this specific
Sure.
paper.
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Absolutely. So, to think about consciousness, um, our ability to be aware of ourselves, to be aware of our environment, to consciously think about, moving your arms and limbs and things like that. Um, you know, Questions come up such as, what is it good for, this consciousness? Why did it develop? And one of the things that the reason I think this is sort of a puzzle is, if consciousness evolved and developed to have us have control over our thoughts and actions and decisions so that we can make the best decisions and perform the best actions, then how come consciousness is so difficult to control? Like, why is mindfulness hard? And if our actions are under our conscious control, then how come dieting is difficult or resisting other urges is difficult? And if we're conscious whenever we're doing, say, a quote unquote complicated activity, how come we can sometimes drive a car and not be consciously aware of the last 10 miles if we're engaged in a detailed conversation with our friends? Questions also come up about whether animals are conscious, whether there's developmental, neurologic, or psychiatric disorders of consciousness. And then also, just even the subjective experience of consciousness, I actually find somewhat puzzling. William James talks about a stream of consciousness. And I think that feels intuitively right to most of us, where there are, events in the future that are rushing towards us. There are events going from the present to the past that are flowing away from us. And then there's this sort of swirling present, like around our feet, of the now. But, we know that this sort of linear metaphor of consciousness isn't really the way our brain works. The brain is actually processing massive amounts of information in parallel. So how come it feels like it's linear? William James also points out that sometimes it's confusing about whether we are consciously aware of a perception or not. And he talks about the situation where you may hear the chimes of a clock counting off the hours and not be paying any attention to it until the last chime sounds. But then you can suddenly become conscious of the prior chimes. Or perhaps a analogy or an example that is even closer to most of us. You may be at a cocktail party and hear your name mentioned by another conversation, and you find that you're actually able to uh, hear the earlier part of that sentence. How could you be consciously aware of that earlier part of that sentence? And this is just one of many examples where consciousness is often occurring in the wrong order. And this is something that has been studied experimentally, where a later stimulus affects one's perception of an earlier stimulus. These are so-called post-dictive effects. A predictive effect predicts the future. A post-dictive effect actually changes the past. And there's all sorts of examples of this in experimental psychology where things like this are happening. And I'll give two examples. One is something called chronostasis, right? It's like stopped time. And it's when we look from one part of the room to another. Normally, there should be a little bit of a blur if we move our eyes quickly, not our heads, but just our eyes quickly from one part of the room to another. And if you were doing a video, for example, with your phone, and you moved it quickly from one side of the room to another, you would see a blur, okay? But we don't experience a blur. And what actually happens is where our eyes land after we have moved them, that image is actually projected backwards in time to fill the missing period of time when we should have experienced a blur. And the reason that we know it's projected backwards in time is if you are wanting to look at a clock in your room, a clock that has a second hand on it, and you look toward that clock, you actually will experience the second lasting an extra amount of time, uh, at least half a second more. And so this is one example, and you can try it for yourself. It really happens. Another example that I think most of us have experienced is actually watching a motion picture. And when you watch a motion picture that was actually shot on film, so this would be like the motion pictures like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, before everything was digitalized. And we have the perceptual apparatus in our brains and eyes to actually perceive the individual frames. And if we see any one of the individual frames for the amount of time it's shown on the screen, we have no difficulty whatsoever in perceiving that frame. But when we see the frames in quick succession, what happens is the later frames actually alter what we see earlier in time, such that our brains infer a smooth, continuous motion. So instead of seeing a bunch of static images in quick succession, we actually see continuous motion. And this is another mystery of consciousness as to why does that occur. Another thing that has been noticed experimentally is that in this experiment that was done by Benjamin Libet, where he asked people to move their wrist, flex their wrist whenever they felt like it. And he put EEG electrodes on their head to monitor their brain activity. And then he had people use a special clock to determine when they made that decision to flex their wrist. What he actually found from the EEG electrodes is the EEG electrodes were actually showing that the person was getting ready to fire their muscles before they made that conscious decision. Libet did another experiment where he actually showed that if you stimulate the finger or you stimulate the part of the brain where sensations of the finger occur, the first thing he noticed is it took about 500 milliseconds of stimulation, half a second of stimulation, for the stimulation to register. And believe it or not, that's actually a long time in brain time. 500 milliseconds. The other thing that he found is that the stimulus of the finger was actually referred backwards in time, such that it appeared that the stimulus of the finger occurred earlier. So, how is that possible that these sort of sensations or perceptions are being referred backwards in time? And when we dive into the timing, it brings up all of these different types of problems that once we understand, and this has been replicated in lots of experiments, that sensations take about half a second for them to be consciously perceived. And when we make a motor action and a motor decision, it takes about 350 milliseconds for that decision to be translated into an action. When we're doing it consciously, consciousness is clearly too slow for it to be in any way directly involved in improvisational music, in sports, in martial arts, and other human activities that are occurring quickly. We also know from some patients that there can be impaired conscious perception with intact action. So, for example, people with blind sight, due to a stroke, for example, may be unable to see in part of their visual field. And you say, where is the spot of light? And they say, I don't know, I can't see it. You say, well, I know you can't see it, but why don't you just guess where you think it is? And people are able to guess with a remarkable degree of accuracy. And so when you take all these things together, you know, the question is, if consciousness is often occurring after perceptions, decisions, and actions, if it's too slow to be participating in many real-time events, and if judgments and actions can occur without conscious perception, and if consciousness is actually difficult to control, it's like, well, what in the world is consciousness actually doing? How does it contribute to our success as human beings? And it was from all of this, and doing my work with my colleagues, that I realized that we could answer all of these different sort of mysteries or unexplained explanations about consciousness if we simply think about consciousness as a memory system. So if consciousness developed essentially to allow encoding, consolidation, and retrieval of memories to take place, all of this would make sense. So it's like, why, instead of parallel processing, why do we experience a unity of perception? Well, because that's how we need to remember it. And why, how can consciousness being a memory, how can that be helpful in explaining the utility of consciousness? And this has to do with the fact that back in 2007, I mentioned, I mentioned that I did my postdoctoral fellowship with this guy, Daniel Schachter, and that was from about 1997 to 2000. Well, in 2007, Schachter and colleagues, along with some other researchers that happened to come across this at the same time, they had this realization that episodic memory, our explicit conscious autobiographical memory, did not develop to remember events verbatim in time. Okay, so it didn't develop to be able to remember exactly what happened to you in the past. But they argued, and I think it's totally correct, that the reason this type of memory, episodic memory, developed is to allow us to flexibly and creatively combine and rearrange memories of prior events to help us plan for the future. And so, this is what I think consciousness does. Consciousness is part of this memory system that allows us to combine the sensory information coming in with our prior experience and factual knowledge to plan for the future. And if you think about it in that way, it's extremely powerful. So let me give you an example. So let's say that you're going home after work and you're doing a little shortcut and you're cutting through a neighbor's yard and you hear this barking, and that uh, uh, bark, through sensory memory, it goes into your working memory, the part of your mind that is able to actively keep in mind and manipulate information. And that bark then goes off to your episodic memory and retrieves a memory of when last week that very same dog ran at you and chased you off the property. Now, once you have all of this information in mind, including the memory, it's not very difficult to imagine the future, right? The dog is probably going to chase you off the property again. Now, so where does all the consciousness comes in? Well, we argue that you need consciousness to be aware of seeing the dog, for your retrieval of the memory of the dog, and for you to imagine the future. Consciousness is required for all those different pieces. Now, there are other types of memory, like conditioning, that doesn't need to have conscious awareness. But whenever the stimulus or the setting are not similar enough to trigger conditioning, that's when you really need this system. Now, you might say, okay, well, fine. So maybe that explains how consciousness and memory are related, but we can use consciousness to do all sorts of things like problem solving and stuff like that. Well, the way that I think problem solving evolved is because once you can use your memories to imagine the future, now you can maybe imagine two different futures. So, for example, you're hungry and you can remember a time of when you picked some berries outside of a cave and it made a delicious lunch. And you think, oh, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But then you remember this other time when you were by that same cave and a bear came out of the cave and started to chase you. And the problem solving comes in when you have these two different memories in mind, and now you're going to work to flexibly, creatively combine the information that you have to try to make one future occur and not the other future. Now you might say, well, where does language comes in? You know, because a lot of our consciousness is involved with talking and thinking in words. And I would say, well, you know, once you have concepts like berries and bears, and you're trying to communicate that to somebody else, so that maybe if the two of you work together, you'll be able to get the berries and avoid the bear. You know, that's how language developed. So maybe by now I've convinced you that, okay, so consciousness is part of this sort of explicit memory system, part of episodic memory and things like that. But how does that really help us understand consciousness? How does that help us with any of those problems that I brought up in the beginning? And my answer is that if consciousness evolved as part of our memory system, that will help us to flexibly, creatively combine and manipulate memories to plan for future action, there's no reason that consciousness needs to operate in real time. There's no reason that consciousness cannot function with a small delay. And for that reason, I suddenly understood that our perception of the world is actually a memory. So conscious perception is actually remembering a sensation. But not only are we remembering this sensation as sort of pure, raw sensory information, we're actually remembering it as a combination or a mashup between these bottom up sensory processes and these top down episodic and semantic memory processes. And once we understand that our conscious perceptions is this mashup that is a memory, then there's no problem with things occurring in the wrong order because we're always just remembering things. So, all those times when the later event is affecting the earlier event, it's all not a problem. It's not a problem with the chronostasis when we move our eyes and things are projected backwards in time because, yeah, our perception is just simply a memory. So it's no problem. It's no problem that sensations are delayed 500 milliseconds and referred backwards in time. That's what memory does. It refers things backwards in time. Now, what about decisions and actions? Well, we argue that the you who decides and acts is actually unconscious. So your conscious decisions and conscious actions are actually memories of those unconscious decisions and actions. And once we understand that, it's not a problem that the motor cortex of the brain is starting to fire first, and then we have the decision to move. It's also no problem that all sorts of sports and improvisational music and martial arts can be too fast for consciousness to be perceiving and acting. That's okay. It's unconscious processes that are perceiving and acting, and then we consciously remember those perceptions and actions. Now, does that mean we never use our conscious minds to make decisions and guide our actions? And we argue, no, not at all. That's not what we're saying. I think that there's many times when things can be done unconsciously, just like if you're driving on a routine highway, you can drive while you're talking with a friend and focus your conscious attention on your conversation. But there's other times, like if you're driving in a downpour, that you absolutely positively need to have all of your conscious energy and focus on your driving. And this distinction between these unconscious processes in sort of simple, easy situations and needing conscious processes in more complicated situations, we pull on a distinction that Kahneman and Tversky made famous. They were two psychologists that actually won the Nobel Prize for economics based on this theory that system one is the unconscious brain processes that perceive, make decisions, and act when things are sort of simple and straightforward. And system two is what I would call the conscious mind and the conscious memory system. It provides this additional layer of information that can be used whenever decisions and actions are difficult and they require additional work, logical thought, things like that. And once we understand that, then all of a sudden it's not so problematic why mindfulness is hard, because consciousness did not develop for us to be in control of actions and decisions. Consciousness developed to be part of our memory system whenever we need to make slow, logical, deliberative processing. So, the next thing I want to talk about is some of the metaphors that I think all of us, from at least time to time, experience and seem right, and also metaphors that have been portrayed through philosophy, literature, and film. And one of these metaphors is so called the Cartesian theater. And Descartes never really talked about Cartesian theater. Daniel Dennett talked about this, but he used it as a metaphor because of the way that Descartes would sort of describe himself, thinking, therefore he is, as sort of like a little homunculus, sitting somewhere in the brain, watching the world go by, through our eyes and things like that. And I don't know what your own intuitive experience is, but I sometimes feel like that. And I also sometimes feel like the metaphor that Plato uses in the Republic of watching shadows on a wall and thinking that they're reality when they're not really reality. Or, if you prefer a more modern metaphor, the metaphor of the movie The Matrix, where people are actually plugged into a computer, and what they think is reality is actually they're performing in a digital world. And I think all of these metaphors resonate with us because they're all telling us a little bit of the truth, which is we don't consciously participate in the world directly. We're actually one step removed. We're actually remembering our perceptions, decisions, and actions. And I want to introduce here one other type of metaphor that I think will help you to understand like what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about us not sort of deciding and acting directly. And that is of a horse and a rider. So I think about the horse as our unconscious brain processes. And I think about the rider as our conscious mind. And the first thing I want to say is like, the rider, your conscious mind is absolutely important for doing any type of, long reaching, deliberative, logical goal. So, for example, if you want this horse to go from Carson City to San Francisco, that horse needs a rider to help it to get there, right? It's not going to get there on its own. But on the other hand, you don't need a rider to tell a horse where to put its hooves to walk across a rocky field or jump over a small wall. The horse knows how to do that all by itself. And while the rider can absolutely tell the horse where the rider would like the horse to go, at the end of the day, it is the horse that decides whether it's going to go down that narrow gully or it's going to walk up that mountain or it's going to trot across the plains, right? The horse is ultimately deciding. And that's sort of how I feel it works. Yes, our conscious mind can absolutely direct our unconscious brain processes, but at the end of the day, the unconscious brain processes decide whether they're going to listen to the conscious mind or not. Now, how come this rider has this good information? Why should the horse bother listening to the rider at all? And we talk about how, well, the rider has these really cool sunglasses that can look out at the world, which is like through sensory memory, although there is a built-in delay. They can look out at the world, but there's a 500 millisecond delay. They can access prior autobiographical information, that's through episodic memory, access prior information about facts, that's semantic memory, and also keep information on the screen of the sunglasses and manipulate it. That's working memory. Or use a combination of all those things to flexibly, creatively imagine the future and future possible outcomes. And that's, of course, what this system does. But the last thing I want to say about this metaphor is the images that the rider sees come from the horse. And that's why mindfulness is hard. The horse decides which images the rider sees because ultimately, we argue the way consciousness developed is it developed as a tool the unconscious brain is using to be able to predict the future. And if you think once again about this sort of Cartesian theater, you can sort of imagine that your conscious mind is actually able to lay different types of scenarios and future possibilities out in front of you in your imagination. And you can sort of move these around, change them, decide which one you're going to go for, just like you're a movie director moving around scenes on a storyboard. And I will say very briefly that we argued in the book, in the paper, that the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain, is the neuroanatomical basis for consciousness. This is based on both experimental psychology work and cognitive neuroscience work, but it's also based on my experience as a clinician looking at patients with a variety of different brain diseases. We argue that there's no one area of the cortex which directs consciousness or is key for consciousness. And again, this is because in my experience, there's no single cortical area, unilateral or bilateral, that leads people to be unconscious. We actually think it's likely that a structure like the thalamus is the hub that is actually controlling and switching back different types or aspects of consciousness. So the idea is that your consciousness of a visual image is in one part of the brain in your occipital lobes. In the superior temporal sulcus is the auditory awareness of consciousness, that these different types or different aspects of consciousness are all occurring in different regions. And then the thing I'm just going to end with is a couple of implications. So if we're correct that the key neuroanatomical structure for consciousness is the cerebral cortex, well, all mammals, and in fact, all vertebrates have either a cortex or something analogous to it. So we argue that all of them are conscious. And I will say that doesn't mean that animals without a backbone are unconscious. It just means our theory doesn't say anything one way or another. So are octopuses conscious? Absolutely. They appear to be conscious by the way they behave. Our theory doesn't really say one thing or the other about them. We think there are neurologic disorders of consciousness, which include strokes, Alzheimer's, and other cortical dementias. We think delirium is a loss of conscious awareness. Migrainous phenomenon, like people that have scintillating scotomas, is a disruption of consciousness. Epilepsy is a disruption of consciousness. We think there are psychiatric disorders of consciousness, including dissociative disorders and schizophrenia. My own son has severe autism. He's nonverbal. He learns through operant conditioning, or how it's called by his teachers, applied behavior analysis. I think autism is a disorder of consciousness. And I think this explains, why it's difficult to control our behavior. Now, some people might be saying, well, who are you anyways? Are you just your conscious mind? And if so, am I saying that people don't have control over their own actions? And my answer is not at all. You are both your conscious mind and your unconscious brain processes. So you're the sum of these. And in fact, because it's your unconscious brain processes that determine your decisions and actions much more directly, that is actually the part of yourself that most people are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Now, can the conscious mind influence decisions and actions? Again, absolutely yes. All we need to do is spend a minute or two thinking about whatever decision and action we want to make, and we are getting the input from our conscious mind into that decision and action. I still do think at the end of the day, it's the unconscious brain processes that decide. Again, if it was as easy as making up your mind, dieting would be simple for everyone, but it's just not like that. I also want to say that, as both a clinician and an educator, I absolutely think people can change both their conscious mind and their unconscious brain processes when they want to or they need to. And this is very consistent with cognitive behavioral therapy. So, what's the key if you want to make changes to your mind or your brain? I actually think beginning to learn to control your thoughts is the start. And that's why I'm a big fan of mindfulness in learning to control your thoughts. And once you begin to learn to control your thoughts, then you can use your thoughts to make changes in your life. I also think that we can tap in to our unconscious brain more than most of us do to help us do better in everything from sports and music to art, insights, science, and creative endeavors. So I'm going to stop there, and I would love to have some discussion.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You covered so many aspects of also questions I had along the lines, and then also people asked in the chat about, you pointed towards free will and all these big questions. You really covered that so well and explained your model so well. And when I was reading your paper, and I'll just ask this question and give everyone else an opportunity, because we might depends on how much time we'll have then later on. But my thought was, this also describes really well, especially in the current situation where people seem to have very different perspectives on situations that happen, in our private lives, also in bigger, in our big political lives, or um, we have, we seem to have very different memories of situations. And this description with, that the horse decides which parts of the situations it will
Mm-hmm.
point you to,
Mm-hmm.
and then makes this, memory out of it, those mosaics of different inputs, is so interesting because that really explains very elegantly this discrepancy we have in different people experiencing the same situation very
Yes,
differently.
yes. I just want to reiterate what you just said, because I would say the sort of ordinary view would be, if two people perceive the same event, clearly the perception will be the same, but maybe they'll remember it differently. But now that we understand that perception is a memory, and we understand that that perceptual memory is a mashup between the raw sensory information and their prior memories and experience, then we actually learn that the actual perception of two different people for the same event, their perception is almost certainly going to be different. So it's not just that they remember it differently, they actually perceive it differently.
Yeah, that is so important to know, and to be aware of, I think, in everyday life and bigger events. And I would say then the most accurate view in retrospective is to take as many observers as you can to build this bigger picture. Or what would you think? Or do we
Yes,
need
yes.
machines to do that? Do we need
What,
to outsource it and let machines record everything? But then again, when we look at the recording, different people will perceive different things, probably.
yeah, well, in fact, it has been studied that when groups of people uh, work to write down what they have witnessed of different events, if they all write down the information separately and then they pool their information together, they actually will have a more accurate depiction of what happens than if any one individual did it themselves. That's been shown.
Yeah, that's really, thank you for sharing that. And if we would be, it's really important to put that message out there, don't you think? Because we sometimes tend um to read maliciousness into, it's lying. Traditionally, people jump to lying, like accusations of lying and so on, really fast. But if we would have that, mm, oh, like that awareness in everyone, basically, do you think that would be really helpful for society and, you know, all
Oh,
situations?
no, no, of course I do. I think, you, you know, this is one of a number of scientific discoveries that should make us be humble and realize that, just because we think we know the truth, we may be wrong. And so I totally agree. We shouldn't be jumping to accuse people.
Well, thank you. And I'll pass the microphone first to Dr. Shah, and then I think Laniakesh and Jonathan, you're next, and then just in PTR order, maybe after Dr. Shah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. That was a really fascinating, research that you shared with us. My question is back to the, conditions such as PTSD, and we know the role of the, for example, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we know that in some of these patients, they have a disruption in prediction, and it just influencing for taking the risk in the future. However, based upon whatever you said, and we know about the predictive neuronal adaptation, which we know that whatever happened in between the neuron, they have a maximum transferring of the information as well as the adaptation. So I was just wondering, what is your opinion based upon your research and by considering this area and PTSD that I just explained?
Well, I think what's interesting about PTSD is there's both the sort of conscious aspect of, often sort of reliving, time traveling, back to the event that caused the trauma. But then there's also the unconscious, I'll use the word conditioning, that occurred due to the trauma that can trigger fear, anxiety, other types of emotions that may or may not be related to any sort of conscious experience that's going on at the time. So, I'm a neurologist and not a psychiatrist, and don't consider myself an expert on PTSD, but I do think that focusing on both the conscious and the unconscious aspects of PTSD, perhaps through cognitive behavioral therapy, would be the way to go.
Thank you. And do you support this hypothesis that it can be, for example, by considering the prediction, minimization by single neuron can be the basic of the consciousness?
So you're asking, what are my thoughts on what's the sort of answer to the hard problem? How does a collection of cells uh, form our own sort of experience of awareness of perceptions and things like that? So my guess, and I use that word on purpose, my guess is that it is a property that comes out of a multi-layered cortex. And I suspect it's just more complicated than any single cell, but I think it's something that needs multiple cells in multiple cortical layers to achieve. That's my best guess.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And Lanya Kush, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Katarina. This has been really interesting, Andrew. Thank you so much. Um, I was just wondering, staying with the analogy of horse and rider, is there such a thing as a centaur? I guess what I'm
Yeah,
saying
yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's very interesting. I guess I would say that not the answer is not in the way that I understand how conscious and unconscious processes work together.
from what you gathered, you believe that conscious and the unconscious are evolutionary locked in that state.
I think we can all work to do a better job of controlling our unconscious brain. I mean, that's why you can work at doing things like having a better control over your behavior for whatever reason. You can certainly work at bringing unconscious processes to conscious awareness. You can work at being a better observer of yourself. You can work on trying to observe other people in ways that your unconscious might have detected, but you didn't consciously detect, such as pay attention to their body language or even their pupil dilation or things like that. So I think that you can sort of work at it, and that maybe some people are intuitively better at doing these things than others. But I just I think if somebody has one without the other, we would end up thinking it's a disorder.
If they weren't acting as separate faculties, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting thought experiment that you have asked me, and at the moment, that's my best answer. But I'll continue to think about it, and I'd love to have your thoughts about it as well.
Mm. Yeah, I'll let everyone ask questions,
Okay.
but yeah, would love to chat maybe about it sometime. Cheers.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that interesting question. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question? Yeah, maybe he's currently away from his app. And I'm not sure if that's your name, but yeah, sorry if I said it wrong.
Yeah, I just changed my name with, to Arabic, so it's Nada. Um, good evening, everyone, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for Dr. Andrew. My question was about the unconscious, and like I want what you think about the unconscious and unconscious mind research. Um, I noticed that you talked about it already. Sorry about the noise. On the example you gave about the unconscious mind, about the horse, and I really want to know more. What do you think about unconscious? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that most of us, because we sort of think of ourselves as conscious being, like when we think about, who am I? We think like Descartes thinks, like cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. But in fact, I do think that it's our unconscious brain processes that determine our character, our personality, what we do like 95% of the time. And again, this is not, I want to just be clear. I don't think I'm the first person to say this. Kahneman and Tversky talked about that most of the time we use system one processes for most things. Malcolm Gladwell also talked about this in his book Blink, that we make fast unconscious processes that are making decisions and perceiving things most of the time. And so I do think that more work needs to be done at understanding our unconscious. And I do think that there's a lot of potential there that can be tapped into. And one way that we all can tap into our unconscious is to use our sleep to perhaps answer questions. And it's been studied experimentally. And if you go to sleep with a problem on your mind, you are more likely to come up with the answer in the morning than, number one, if you didn't decide consciously that you want to ask that question, or if it was the same amount of time, say 8 hours, across when you're awake instead of being asleep. So it's a great comment and question, and I think there's a lot more we can do with the unconscious.
Thank you for the answer, and I really want to know more about unconscious, and especially that whenever we talk about unconscious, we find someone just say, "Oh, it's not scientific, and you can't confirm anything," and so yeah, it's just like that, and we stop discussion. So yeah,
Well, you can refer them to my paper.
I will, yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
Hello, everyone. If I may, my name is Oleg.
I think Eric was waiting and Shiraz.
Sure, sure. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah, I'll wait.
Thank you. We just go
Sure,
in
sure, sure.
PTR order. Thank you.
Oh, okay,
Or I
okay,
think
okay.
actually John, I think you were next. Thank you.
Hello.
Oh, let
Can
me
you
know. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hey.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Andrew. See, when you talk about you believe autism is also a kind of consciousness disorder.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate that a little
Yeah.
bit more?
Yes. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, John. So as I think I mentioned briefly, so my son has autism, and autism is on a spectrum. There's a lot of different um, aspects of autism. There's a lot of different severities of autism, and I do want to make it very clear that my comment is only relevant for people like my son with severe classic Kanner autism, people who cannot talk using words, people who learn with applied behavior analysis, and things like that. And I don't want it in any way to say my son is completely unconscious, but just that he has a disorder that I think affects his ability to use this conscious memory system to be able to control his behaviors and his actions. And unfortunately, my son engages in sometimes self injurious behaviors or aggressive behaviors because he's used those behaviors in the past and he was able to get the attention or whatever it was that he needed. And it's very difficult to to get around that. There are all sorts of people that have different forms of autism who I'm sure don't have a disorder of consciousness. But I do think there's some situations where people are quite severe and have a certain type of autism that I do see aspects of consciousness and memory impaired. Individuals like my son cannot learn in the normal way. They don't form semantic memories in the normal, typical way. They don't form language in the normal, typical way. So that's all I'm trying to say there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I always think the autism is because something is really occupying some seconds kind of thoughts is occupying the patient's mind, and so let them they're busy to dealing with this thoughts instead of dealing with the environment. But well, probably it's a little bit different. But anyway, yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, no problem.
Hey, Eric, how are you? Oh, thank you, John, for that question. That was really.
And Eric, this is a repeat performance for you. I hope it wasn't too similar to the last time we spoke.
No, definitely. I'm always down to have a review session. I find myself reviewing things in the era of like YouTube, watch things maybe 2 or 3 times, and it kind of you get a different feel for things after a certain while. I'm reminded of the famous Simpsons line, "Lisa needs braces, dental plan." And today, when you were speaking and discussing, the idea that the neocortex, there's no one region that's kind of controlling all of these zones. That's something that always appealed to me because I looked at something like the IBM Synapse project where they had asynchronous circuit design and everything's just flowing all the time. It's really more of a matter of I guess orbits or differential equations, at least from the modeling perspective that I had. So it was nice to see that in terms of being frustrated sometimes with the status quo, with the dogma, you can challenge and come out on top. So just an interesting observation from hearing that today. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. Shiraz, did you have a question?
Yes, Katrina, thank you. Hi, Professor Andrew. My question to you is, how do you see ADHD in the context of your hypothesis? Because you mentioned that this consciousness is something that is related to episodic memory, and I tend to have problems with episodic memory a lot. Like I don't remember anything from my childhood, and I'm just 22 years old. And you also mentioned in your paper that this consciousness arose and as something that was also important in solving abstract problems, problem solving, and so on. And those things are also complicated, compromised in ADHD. So, in a sense, from my personal experience, I think that consciousness that is experienced in ADHD is qualitatively different from from the neurotypical consciousness. Like, I can understand that most people are communicating through non-verbal, non-conscious processes which I do not understand. Like they are speaking a language that I do not understand. Their non-verbal cues are very different, and I have to really pay attention to what they mean, and I have to apply logic, and I have to apply my own intuitions to know what they are doing, because the nature of our unconscious is very different as far as I can tell. And there's a lot of evidence for that. My experience of time, it appears to me, is very different from how neurotypicals experience time. Like I don't have a sense for time. It's like it doesn't even exist, I like to say. But most neurotypicals have a very acute sense of time, and they are able to do things on time and so on. And there's also a theory from Carl Jung who said that besides a personal unconscious, there's also something called collective unconscious, and these are the memories in your brain which are there even before you're born. So what do you think about that collective unconscious, which is not related to your personal experience, but which are archetypes, mental templates that you are born with, and with that lead you to
Yes,
have some kind of
yes, I'm
experience?
familiar with Jung. So let me begin by saying, so I think what you were describing in terms of yourself. So one thing you mentioned is that you have trouble remembering your childhood. And that's not necessarily abnormal. It all depends a little bit on, you know, what you were doing, how memorable things were. I think that, everybody is a little bit different in terms of, what details they can bring up from different periods of their life, but not remembering, a lot of your childhood is not necessarily abnormal. We actually have a book, Elizabeth Kensinger and I think I mentioned it, called Why We Forget and How to Remember Better, the Science Behind Memory. And we talk about why people forget different things and why it may be difficult to remember things from long ago, and that it's not necessarily abnormal. So I don't want you to feel that there's something wrong with you just because you have trouble remembering your childhood. The other thing that I think you described actually quite eloquently is some of the difficulties with autism spectrum disorder. I wasn't clear whether you were saying attention deficit disorder or autism spectrum disorder, but I think what you described,
No, I was describing ADHD behavior.
yeah.
There are
So
also some theories. There are also some theories which say that ADHD also has deficits in theory of mind, for example.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what you described about having difficulty in being able to detect the sort of verbal, non-linguistic parts of communication, in my mind, that's not really consistent with ADHD, at least not how I understand it. But it's more consistent with autism spectrum disorder. But either way, I certainly agree that there are many times that people have difficulty in perceiving these sort of non-verbal unconscious cues, and that you can train yourself, like it sounds like you've done, to be able to bring these unconscious cues to conscious awareness. And I think that's a terrific thing to do. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, in terms of Carl Jung and these ideas of unconscious archetypes, I do, I think it makes sense in the way that when we listen to a story, we want the protagonists to win. We want them to overcome obstacles. We root in general for the underdog. I do think that there are things that are built into our brains because presumably people that sort of have a narrative, a story in certain ways, were more likely to overcome obstacles, to persevere, to survive. And maybe you have to have something intuitively built in to believe that even when you're faced with seemingly impossible odds, that you still have a chance of succeeding. So that certainly resonates with me.
Well, I have a question. You have you done any twin studies where since those who are twins, they have a very identical genetic code. How does that affect their unconscious? Like, should
No,
they have similar?
no,
No,
I
not all.
haven't. I haven't done anything like that. That's an interesting idea.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that really interesting
It,
discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just say I have about I had only blocked off an hour, so I have about 5 more minutes. I apologize. I
Oh,
didn't
you don't need
realize
to.
how.
I was about
Yeah,
to check with you how much time you have, so I'm glad you said that. So I think Oleg, you have the last question. I know you waited very patiently, so here you go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for this wonderful room. Um, I had a couple of questions, but I'll take down to one. And what is fascinating is that, for example, shock therapy that people like Wim Hof uses, for and he has a very extensive um, stats as far as like people with PTSD and different severe uh, disorders, have a good result of healing. And I'd be curious to see like your point of view on that. And another thing is that, uh, we're talking about the past, like our conscious mind is like somewhat like a few milliseconds past, but there's also a great line of thought of, of quantum thoughts, actually, the observer effect, so that, the force and the writer, they somewhat, observe their journey and they may have a particular intent of on a specific aspect of this journey, and no doubt that will affect the result. So yeah, that would be my question. I'd be curious what you think of that. Thank you.
sure, sure. So in terms of ECT, ECT is very interesting, in particular because it does tend to produce temporary memory deficits. And some people believe that the production of the memory deficits is actually important for the relieving of depression. So it's an interesting idea to think of. Are you actually changing people's consciousness by altering their memory, and is that in some way cause them to have a change in their mood? It's very interesting. I don't have an answer. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a neurologist, so it's just not my area of expertise. And then in terms of um, your second question, can you just say it one more time? Just remind me of it.
the second question is,
Yes.
Sam, line of thought of like people like Joe Dispenza, of quantum thoughts actually.
Yes,
The,
yes,
the,
yes. Right,
the
right, right,
consciousness
right.
creates the future reality.
Being observer. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there's no doubt that if people are self-conscious and self-reflective, that it's going to alter their behavior. But I would say in general, when people are self-aware, it's nothing but a good thing. I think that it gives people the biggest opportunities to change and grow for the better when people are observing their behavior. So I think it can be a very good thing most of the time.
Well, thank you so much for the question, Oleg. And of course, thank you so much, Andrew, for this wonderful talk and taking so much time to answering questions. Already have requests to invite you back again, so maybe next year one day.
Yeah, well, when my new book's coming out February 1st, so if that,
Oh yeah, perfect.
if you'd like to have me back in February, I'd love to come back and talk
Oh
about the book.
yes, that would be perfect. Yes, please. That's wonderful news.
Great.
So congratulations and yeah, thank you. This was wonderful. Such a great discussion. We really appreciate the time you took, and yeah, I hope we hear each other back in February. And
Okay.
everyone,
Very good. Okay.
th-
Take care.
thanks. Bye, and enjoy
Bye.
your weekend. And thank you everyone for coming for this very vivid discussion. Also in the chat, all the contributions. We really appreciate that. It makes the discussion so interesting because I would maybe just ask very questions that go what goes on in my mind, so we have a much bigger picture of this topic when people participate, so that's really wonderful. There were so many great questions that I wouldn't have asked, so thank you for that and enjoy your weekend. And we'll have 2 rooms next week because I will be traveling, so we have less rooms. Follow the club, check it out, and yeah, happy weekend everyone. Thank you. I'll close the room in 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everyone. Bye.